Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. Welcome to our second Law of Science event. I'm Simon Sun, the co-founder of Law of Science. Law of Science is an academic initiative coordinated by a group of SJD candidates who share the same belief in legal methodologies. Legal studies have been generally understood as a discipline outside science, traditionally consisting of doctrinal analysis and debates on normative questions. However, we believe it can be improved by and benefit from scientific methodologies that provide systematic ways to approach questions and deliver falsifiable claims. If you want to learn more about the Law of Science project, please visit our website, www.lawofscience.org, and you can join our email list. To that end, I want to introduce our coordinators, Vanessa Villanueva, who is a JSC candidate from the University of Illinois College of Law.
Hello, everybody. We're here all together, all the JC candidates, some of them are visiting scholars.
Yeah, welcome, guys. Patrick Huang Zongjia, who is a JSD candidate from the law school at the University of Chicago.
Hello, everyone.
And Daniel Hifke, who is a JSD candidate from Cornell Law School.
Hello, everybody.
I also want to introduce Kathy Kim, who is an SJD candidate and the coordinator at the Graduate Colloquium at Mara School of Law.
Hello, everyone.
The Graduate Colloquium at Indiana University is where doctoral candidates at Mara School of Law find their niche. Today, we are very honored to have Professor Michelle Christian with us for our Fall 2022 Law Science event. Professor Michelle Christian is an associate professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville in the Department of Sociology and the director of undergraduate studies. Her research focuses on connecting critical race and racism concepts to understanding how racial inequality occurs within the global political economy. Professor Christian developed the global critical race and racism framework to outline how global white supremacy reproduces in the 21st century and elaborated on the theoretical constructions of transnational racialization, transnational intersectionality, and deep and malleable whiteness. For her empirical studies, she employs structural fieldwork methods to her research designs to explore how political economic change occurs and its impact on forms of precarious work. She has conducted field research in Kenya, Uganda, Costa Rica, and the United States, and oversaw research in South Africa, Indonesia, China, and India as part of a collaborative international and interdisciplinary research project supported by UK DFID called Capturing the Gains. Her most recent research focuses specifically on labor and working conditions and its connection to racial and gendered practices. Since 2014, she has collaborated with Ugandan partners to collect data on the working conditions of domestic workers in 4 regions in Uganda. Professor Michelle Christian received her PhD in sociology from Duke University. Today, Professor Christian's speech is titled, A Critical Race Theory of Global Colorblindness. We will have time for Q&A, so please prepare your questions. The event will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel, so you can either raise your hand or write down your questions in the chat box, and I'll read them for you. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Professor Michelle Christian.
Thank you. Let's see if I can figure this out this time.
Okay.
Let's see if this works. So everyone can see the first screen and nothing else? Okay, great.
Very good, yeah.
Perfect. Well, hello. It's so nice to be with you here today. Before I begin, I would just like to thank the organizers of Law of Science for the invitation to present on my work. I would also like to thank my friends and colleagues, and I think one graduate student I see, and everyone in the audience who are here to engage and learn. So my presentation, A Critical Race Theory of Global Colorblindness, is based on a forthcoming chapter in the book Critical Race Theory and International Law, edited by Devin Carbato, Kimberly Crenshaw, Justin Stein, and Chantal Thomas. I'm also adapting this chapter for the book I'm currently writing this year titled Racist World. I have long been thinking about global color blindness for quite a bit of time now, as I have done, as was mentioned, numerous field studies on race, racism, and political economy across the globe, geographies ranging from Costa Rica, Uganda, China, and when I began teaching a graduate level course on global racism. With these experiences, I was always struck by how similar racial patterns across geographies formed and how they were always rooted in the maintenance of white supremacy, even if there were no bodies traditionally racialized as white present in those geographies. Through these travels, I also saw the different ways race and racism were discursively addressed and produced through policies that showed comparable contours to what we in the United States have studied as forms of colorblindness. Colorblindness seemed to be the glue upholding racial inequality and national racial regimes in similar and distinct ways. So I knew I wanted to dive deeper into how this operates globally and take shape regionally and transnationally. So with that background context, in today's presentation, I'm going to first briefly highlight emerging scholarship that combines critical race theory and international law. Next, I will outline how critical race scholars approach an understanding to racial ideology and how we can begin to scale up racial ideology beyond traditional national nation-state boundaries. I then will lay out the components to how I conceptualize a critical race theory of global colorblindness with examples from 6 what I identify as global colorblind politicultures. And lastly, I'll end with reiterating the value of a critical race theory of global colorblindness perspective as a way to understand continued global racial inequality in the 21st century. In mainstream international law and international relations scholarship broadly, we find that race is either ignored, reduced in significance, and or uncritically interpreted in what Robert Vitalis calls the norm against noticing. But over the last 10 years or so, there has been a growing call to acknowledge the racial dimensions to international law and combine critical race theory epistemologies to international laws in ways that is complementary to what's been labeled third world approaches to international law, or TWAIL. Legal scholars and theorists leading this charge make 3 main arguments. First, they challenge the current conceptual invisibility of racial analyses that works to dehistoricize and deracialize why we have a vastly unequal global world. They particularly expose how white supremacy was the norm, not the exception to the history of global foreign relations. Scholars such as Christopher Gevers and Alexander Barter have argued how assumptions of white superiority, racial white geopolitical paranoia, and racialized constructions of civilized and backward nations historically anchored assumptions in international relations and law and supported white European global dominance. The venerable journal Foreign Affairs was originally called the Journal of Race Development between 1910 and 1919. Secondly, these scholars also highlight how the taken for granted terms we use today, such as sovereignty and nation state, all emerge from empire cartographies and in the vestiges of colonial rule. Doctrines of sovereignty were formulated in the 17th century after Spanish European encounters with indigenous groups. The indigenous groups were constructed as needing to be redeemed and civilized, essentially what Aoki describes as lacking sovereignty. Therefore, Europeans were supposedly just in their conquest. Second, these scholars bring our attention to the contemporary de-racialized assumptions which steer international law discourse. This is particularly seen through the creation of the, quote, developing nation in need of, quote, economic development, democratic institutions, and the will to protect human rights. As I will address later, these seemingly positive attributes that countries need to capture for participation in global communities help to de-racialize continued global racial power imbalances and hides continued racist practices. Third, these scholars also challenge the de-racialized governance of our global institutions. Valdez and Cho's conceptualization of a critical race materialism approach for the global order, for example, exposes how we must view the rise of multilateral organizations such as the WTO, the World Bank, and broadly the history of the United Nations as racialized organizations that present themselves as colorblind and post-racial. The silence on race at the global level is connected to the way racial ideology works. Race is not just an idea about racial animus and difference, it is about power and what critical race scholars call structures of domination. Therefore, in order to articulate a critical race theory of global colorblindness, I need to first outline the contours to racial ideology. I find the structural perspectives of the scholars Stuart Hall, Woody Doan, Moon Ki Young, Zeus Leonard, and Eduardo Bonilla Silva particularly instructive. For these groups of scholars, the most important aspect is centering the idea of materiality, the notion that racial ideology has a material base and race does not exist without racism. Racism therefore organizes social relations, distributes values, rewards, and creates racial subjectivities and categories. Next is exploring how racial ideology is embedded in an assemblage of practices and apparatus that are all collectively connected to a complex total racial structure. Apparatus are the institutions that shape our lives, from economics, politics, education, to the media. Within this assemblage, a racial toolkit forms, which are the racial frames, narratives, representations that help us make sense of a racial world around us and our particular place in it. Racial ideology is also always in process, historically specific, and changes over time, while also maintaining what Moon Ki Young describes as the deep schemas of racial differences. The power of racial ideology particularly works through unconscious and hegemonic adoption. Therefore, conscious intent is not necessary for the production of racist practices. Lastly, racial ideology sustains racial power and justifies and legitimizes the racial order maintaining racial inequality. Acutely, racial power turns racial ideology into racial knowledge that is then conceived as absolute, objective, and rational. Since the creation of the idea of race, those racialized as white have held the acute hegemonic power over defining racial knowledge and what is viewed as a racial matter. I apply these insights on racial ideology to expand how we think about color blindness as a form of global racial ideology. We have over 30 years of scholarship on color blindness within the United States' context, both sociologically and within legal studies. We have yet to apply those insights globally. With a critical race theory of global color blindness, I shift our analytic attention in several ways. First, rather than think about color blindness as something that just emerged in a post-civil rights, post-colonial landscape, I look at contemporary global color blindness as both distinctive and a continuation of colorblind forms of the past. Unpacking continuities with change discloses how color blindness, as Young attests, is relatively shown to be at shallow depths in comparison to the deep schemas of global anti-Blackness and white supremacy. Second, I outline colorblind practice as not just discursive frames and languages, as documented by many sociologists, but also the structural policies that produce inequities. Third, I scale up the assemblage of colorblind practices to global forces beyond the nation state, which exposes the complexity, malleability, and stability of colorblindness at a transnational level, and how the transnational forces of colorblindness shape specific regions and geographies. And lastly, I scale up racial power to document the production of global white supremacy and how it reproduces itself in a seemingly invisible fashion. Accordingly, with this analytic shift and an attention to scale, context, and elasticity, I conceptualize a critical race theory of global colorblindness, or CRTGC, in 5 ways. First, CRTGC is predicated on racist erasure. The end of World War II, the passage of civil rights legislation in the United States, perceived global decolonization, and the collapse of apartheid in South Africa ushered in an era of racist erasure. The international retreat from race activated a deliberate erasure of a racism as a global system, its formation and production in European influenced empire making, and its persistent practices of disposition, displacement, labor exploitation, and violence. Racist erasure takes on further regional and national states of denial. For example, for former European empires, expunging racist history creates a context where race is always somewhere else, not within its borders. For many post-colonial geographies, there are differences between white settler societies and non-white settler societies, and the avenues of how parts of colonial racial history are ignored, minimized, or denied, but all point to, with empire states, a larger politics of epistemological, historical, racial disavowal. Second, global colorblindness is produced by a global racial paradigm of colorblindness and the politiculture of neoliberalism. A global racial paradigm of colorblindness incorporates and scales up sociologist Vilna Bashi-Treitler's conceptualization of racial paradigms and politicultures. Racial paradigms organize how essentially race works and are emblematic of the racial common sense we use. The global racial paradigm of global colorblindness calls our attention to the scale of transnational practice that intersect with regional, national, and local contexts, but points to continuities, similarities, and convergences. Globally, there are what Verhoeven calls circulating iconic racial meanings, unfolding synchronistically across geographies applied to racialized bodies and groups that conjure perceived racial truths without ever evoking direct racial rationale. Collectively, we find a transnational assemblage of global colorblind practices and discourses. The politiculture of neoliberalism provides the rules, policies, logics, and beliefs that represents global colorblindness in practice. Neoliberal projects depict logics of individualism, privatization, unfettered markets, limited state intervention, free trade, democracy, and private freedoms. Within these abstract projects, according to David Theo Goldberg, race evaporates and is pushed out of sight, but usually always hiding in plain sight. The politiculture of neoliberalism is so insidiously effective because it embodies the latest genealogy of racial modernity. Historically, as Charles Mills and others attest, liberal ideas were always used in conjunction to race. Contemporarily, three specific projects in the politiculture across scales embedded in specific apparatus and institutions are particularly pronounced. Those are human rights, developmentalism, and securitization. Ugandan feminist legal scholar Sylvia Tamale exposes the coloniality inherent in a human rights system, where she says Africans and those racialized as non-white were viewed as objects rather than subjects in international law. She notes how human rights terminology sound righteous and inherently good, but hold no eternal truth or supreme value, and are, according to Okafor, a one-way traffic paradigm where the Western world is framed as the standard human rights bearer. Thus, human rights as a default standard of equality throughout the global system produce global colorblindness by facilitating the illusion of a race-neutral, equal global plane governed by deracialized states, protecting individual rights. Next, the neoliberal project of developmentalism represents a form of global racial capitalism that turns formerly colonized and underdeveloped racial geographies in the global north into geographies just in need of development. Anthropologist Jemima Pierre calls this the racial vernacular of development. As a racial vernacular, development discourse comes to life in the policy regimes they support, and we find racial inequality being perpetuated without ever alluding to race. Lastly, the discourses and practices of securitization work to protect national borders, demarcate the lines of deserved citizenship, shape foreign policy, and criminal statutes. They represent an abstract commitment to colorblindness while managing perceived internal and external racial threats. Notably, new contemporary white racial anxiety and anxiety from states attempting to capture and negotiate whiteness inform securitization in profound ways. States enact, according to Catherine Baker, racialized security regimes, dictating who they allow in, who they target and police, who they support in foreign affairs, and who they frame as deserving immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Third, the practices of the global neoliberal politiculture with the foundation of racist erasure intersect and interact across the global racial system, creating complex, varying colorblind politicultures. Across the globe, we find a vast array of colorblind politicultures that appear with similar and different racial significations, distinctions, and common sense understandings. Therefore, colorblindness is not uniform, but characteristics of the synergy between global racist erasure and global neoliberal projects that descend in geographies that have their own local worldviews and specific regional, national, and cultural stratification milieus. I identify 6 colorblind politicultures within the world system. These politicultures are post-racialism, multiculturalism, mestizaje and racial democracy, ethnic dominance, the predicament of Blackness, and conservative right. These are not exhaustive and exact, but are ideal types to categorize colorblind ideological phenomena across regions and geographies. They're also not static. Some evolve from one another, can take place simultaneously, and overlap. 4, despite all colorblind politicultures, despite differences, all colorblind politicultures reflect a stable global racial architecture between whiteness and anti-Blackness. The white-Black architecture, however, does not preclude racist exploitation of other non-white racialized groups. These groups rather experience and navigate global and national racial fields in various ways informed by their racial marginalization and structural proximity to our distance from whiteness and or in solidarity with Blackness. Therefore, the global color line is inherently messy, but it nonetheless was built upon the foundation of global white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Moreover, importantly, the racial architecture also uncovers how different colorblind politicultures are not equal. Regional and country varieties of colorblindness emanating from former colonized geographic histories are not the same as former Western Empire and white settler geographies, which structure and dictate the global racial paradigm of colorblindness. 5, CRTGC is anchored in the active global performance of white racial ignorance that facilitates a white racial power that authoritatively controls, defines, and manages the knowledge of what race is across the globe. Global colorblindness is only possible because it embodies what Gloria Wecker argues is a militant, aggressive ignorance posing as knowledge. As my friend Jenny Mueller writes, white racial ignorance requires real effort and dedication in a world saturated with evidence of racism and the suffering, counter discourses, and resistances of people of color. Now, I want to briefly highlight some of the contours to these 6 colorblind politicultures I just identified. Post-racialism, or what my colleague in Germany, Cengiz Barksanamaz, calls non-racialism, is most dominant in Western Europe, specifically France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Spain. Post-racialism represents a form of colorblindness where race, according to Sumi Cho, sees societies transcending race. But transcendence is also coupled with historical expungement. It is not just that areas transcend the problem of race, but for some countries, race is perceived to never really have been a problem to begin with. France is the quintessential case. French republicanism and universal claims on equality while facilitating policies and discourses of racist inequities. Germany and Italy also exhibit interesting and similar post-racial practices as well. Italy and Germany, like France, have attempted to eradicate in law the terms raza and rasa, but under different historical contexts. The history of the Holocaust for Germany and the belief in Italy that race is not really an issue and the colonial enterprise was not really that impactful. Spain's post-racialism, however, is formed by a centuries-long what scholars describe as a crisis of whiteness, where Spain had to navigate a perception of not being racially pure by other European countries, and subsequently created a mythology of contemporary Spanish homogeneity that is also connected to what is perceived to be the positive aspects of Spanish colonialism. Importantly, post-racial colorblind politicultures in Western Europe shape the colorblind politicultures in other regions and countries, notably in how those countries must navigate unequal transnational development power dynamics, human rights discourses and or allegations, and security frames. In contrast to post-racialism, multiculturalism does not deny race, but clouds it in a discourse of culture and diversity. It is found most dominantly in white settler societies, for example, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, sparingly in Europe, such as the UK, and in post-colonial city like Singapore. The policies and narratives that focus on cultural differences and inclusion, however, often negate the production of racism by positioning an even plane of diversity amongst groups. Mestizaje and racial democracy politicultures are about group racial mixture, hybridity, and fluidity. Mestizaje is most associated with Mexico, Central America, and parts of South America and Spanish American colonized Caribbean, while racial democracy is applied to Brazil, the country with the largest African descendant population. Mestizaje notably formed as a state-building project in the 19th and early 20th centuries in the negotiation and response to scientific racism and the belief that newly independent, formerly Spanish colonized geographies were globally racially inferior. Spanish descendant elites then in those geographies simultaneously heralded the mestizo or indio or Ladino while pursuing a series of whitening policies for the population and by denying Blackness and Asian subjectivities and only symbolically incorporating parts of indigenous culture. This legacy shapes the region today in conjunction with American transnational racialization and further produces practices of anti-Blackness, anti-Asianness, and anti-indigeneity, but all under a guise of supposed mixture. The ethnic dominance politiculture centers ethnic homogeneity in state formations divorced from race. Ethnic dominance is most pronounced in East Asia, Eastern Europe, Turkey, and somewhat in the Middle East, but also seen in South Asia. Ethnicity, in some cases, also merges with religion and ancestral affiliation to cement group authority. In this colorblind politiculture, supposedly natural, homogeneous ethnic histories eclipse the specter of race and the reality of local ethno-racial diversity. Ethnic dominant state formation policies and discourses form in navigation with the global racial field between whiteness and anti-Blackness and its regional geopolitical markers that it informs. Countries compete and position themselves along the field by negotiating their historic global racialization and adapting global racial cultural codes to their specific local geographies, producing essentialized ethnic national identities that are constructed as not about race, but about ethnicity. For example, we see this with the history of Han superiority practices in China that first began in the late 19th and early 20th century to counter global anti-Asian racism, or in the idea of Slavic whiteness in Russia, which since the rise of Vladimir Putin shapes Russian identity in relation to the constructed non-white Russian populations within and outside its borders. And with the cultivation of ethnic national identities in Turkey, Iran, and India, where historically those identities were connected to the Aryan racial myth of pure European whiteness. Ethnic dominance ideals in interaction with global forces then shape local development, security, and human rights policies. Moreover, a new race science, as Dorothy Roberts explores here in the United States, is also forming in these geographies, as increasingly ethnic biological essentialism is proclaimed, but devoid supposedly of racist presumption. We are particularly seeing this in Russia right now. I adopt a colorblind politiculture term, predicament of Blackness, from Jemima Pierre, whose book Predicament of Blackness addressed global racial formation and its impact in Ghana and Africa broadly. This politiculture highlights how geographies racialized as Black have to navigate how racism is taken out of the equation by global actors in shaping local material experiences and how local geographies respond and navigate what philosopher Achille Mbembe calls the duality of Blackness. Responses range from solidifying Black diaspora solidarities to the sidelining of racial analyses with class, to negotiating the fallout to colonial crafted ethnic racial divisions. Still, the politiculture is less about how these geographies enact forms of colorblindness and more about how they experience the consequences of global colorblindness. Through transnational anti-Blackness, these geographies bear the brunt of colorblind neoliberal development, security, and human rights policies and discourses. Lastly, the conservative right politiculture highlights the rise of global conservative, alternative right, but now mainstream conservative discourse, where partisans practice a politics of what Casey Kelly labels repressive victimhood. Repressive victimhood turns whiteness and white subjectivities into an oppressed majority. A combination of colorblind liberal tenets and securitization discourses and policies are used to claim white victimhood. With this colorblind politiculture, What was once actually classically racist is now denied at every turn with an assemblage of liberal, seemingly reasonable discursive proclamations about preserving white Western cultural and material values. We see this in places like the United States currently and the United Kingdom, particularly with the Leave campaign advocating for the Brexit vote, in Brazil with the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro, in Hungary, and in recent elections in Italy and Sweden. In closing, a critical race theory of global colorblindness shows us how global colorblindness hides in plain sight. It is flexible, adaptable, and increasingly contradictory, as we see with the last example of the rise of the conservative right. Global colorblindness is expansive, interconnected, and rooted in power inequities between regions and racialized groups. Global colorblindness sustains a global racial hierarchy between whiteness and anti-Blackness. And lastly, global colorblindness continues 21st century global white supremacy at a transnational level and unfolds in similar and distinctive ways across the globe. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions about the presentation and also answer any other questions you might have about my work more broadly. I was telling Simon before, part of my project within sociology is linking kind of more traditional critical race theory within sociology and doing that through empirically based research. So I'll be happy to answer any questions about that as well. And also the current anti-CRT mania that is here in the United States and shaping, unfortunately, and moving across the globe.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Christian. It was very, very thought-provoking. So we have entered the Q&A session, and today we have a very international based audience here. So sure you have a lot of questions for Professor Christian. And again, just to remind, the event will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube, so you can either raise your hand or write down your questions in the chat box, and I will read them for you. So we do have a question here from Howard Lee. He said, critical race theory of international law is never away from politics. So he wonders how the critical race theory interacts with international politics. For example, the most relevant state plays an important role in certain international legislation. When it comes to Wales, Japan, and Iceland are weighting more than others. So he wonders how your theory applies to the real politics as such, where the color blindness could work or promote the international law design or enforcement here.
I'm a little unclear about the question. Is it about just politics in general, or the discursive kind of political realm of politics at the nation state level? Or I guess I'm just a little more clarity, please.
Yeah, so Harry, feel free to open up your camera, but I understand what he wants is what he's asking is in terms of the international law perspective, like within that context, how would it help his, like if you're researching international law, how would this framework help expand, or understand kind of the race component inside there? If I'm correct, Howard.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
No, thank you for that question. And just a caveat, I am not a full-on international law legal scholar as a sociologist, but because as I mentioned, this chapter is coming out in this larger book about international law and CRT, I was trying to engage a little bit with some of the broader kind of critiques within international law and some of the TWAIL scholars who broadly have called attention just plainly of kind of the deracialization of the law. And this gets into a larger context here in the United States we talk about within the CRT tradition, is that the law is perceived to be colorblind through a formal equality, which kind of erases the larger history of the decolonial project and how all these states had to emerge within the global order they didn't create. And so when we think about policies that govern the international law, I think from a CRT perspective and kind of countering colorblindness would be, how would you, and and as a not being a legal scholar, I'm not saying I would know how to write this within the law, but how would you create race consciousness within international law? Like, how would you acknowledge the unjust enrichment that European empire powers achieved through 400 years of African enslavement, indigenous disposition, and direct colonialism? You know, like, how do you actually think about kind of transformative international justice in a way that is not just kind of a South African model of kind of reconciliation, but actually looks at material distribution? And I just want to say, like, my critique of this and calling out color blindness, you know, and this is what scholars, we get into the weeds about, you know, is not to say that, you know, maybe tools within international law and even the language of liberalism could still be used, but how do we do that in a racial conscious, global racial democracy way? And I think that's what we're trying to figure out, is if that's possible. And if that's not possible, what are some new tools within indigenous African epistemologies to think about governance? Is that helpful? I saw that you specifically asked about Japan and Iceland. I wasn't quite sure the context of that, but I know a little bit about both of those countries somewhat within how race is constructed, so I'd be happy to engage with that as well.
Yeah, I think, yeah, Howard said that's helpful. And Howard, if you want to kind of elaborate more, feel free to type in the chat box in terms of those countries. Daniel, I see your hands up.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Yeah, first of all, thank you. I think this was super fascinating. I really like the topic and the presentation. So I have two interrelated questions, and they're both going into the direction if the framing of white supremacy, like especially the global framework, not CRT as such, but especially the global framework might be too monocausal. So the first question is basically, how would you factor in questions of intersectionality? So, you know, gender, sexual orientation and such also obviously influence perceptions of inferiority. And they can also influence concepts of race. As I know there's some historical work on how class has sometimes influenced conceptions of race. And the second question is, how do you deal with power structures that are not only based on imagined inferiority of other groups, but imagined superiority? So especially in conspiracy thinking, and especially anti-Semitism, for example, where they're prevalent. So yeah, are these questions factored in, or is my question wrong because the framework tries to answer a different question?
No, thank you. Those are really excellent questions. And coming out of this conference, I was just in the last weekend, I was told that I am a lumper, not a splitter. And that is definitely kind of my theoretical and kind of methodological identity, where I kind of throw everything into my pot as an explanatory variable. So I could see how that also opens me up to important constructive criticism, pushback too. I guess for me, but particularly intersectionality, obviously the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and others within the legal field, which she is also an editor of this book too. So, you know, very much plays into it. And I have addressed kind of transnational intersectionality and really tried to theoretically fuse particularly gender and sexuality with an analysis of race. And in the book I'm currently writing, I'm doing this more kind of more in a synthesis, and that when I'm constructing the history of modernity with the idea of race and the practices of racism, I'm also showing how gender and sexuality played as a form of racialization. So how African women's bodies were constructed, indigenous women's bodies were constructed, were used as a way to prove an idea about race. But I mean, I do have to admit, you know, maybe, and this is probably a limitation, that, you know, I seem to always defer back to the famous Stuart Hall quote where, you know, race is a modality which class has lived. And I kind of see that through these other modalities too. It's not that race trumps it per se, but that it's organizing it in key ways. But I definitely look to colleagues, friends, scholars to push me and to also do that work in really profound ways, particularly with the ways heteronormativity and other things around sexuality are also being constructed through laws, and how white supremacy kind of pits groups against each other in these really profound ways too. So I definitely encourage that kind of analysis and literature to keep, pushing us in that way, because I think that's really important. An example of this would be some of my work in Uganda, which you have to think about gender, race, sexuality, and the role of religion, because of Christian white supremacy really shaping what's happening in the country right now because of the material power they're bringing to the country. So all of these things kind of have to fuse in really important ways. The second question about anti-Semitism, I'm not quite sure I got the full kind of gist of the question, so please feel free to interject. But was it about, can you actually reframe that question one more time?
So I know there are theories who basically don't want to understand anti-Semitism in the same way as racism is understood, but basically with a different explanation structure behind that. And the explanation structure basically is that it's based on obviously not a real, but imagined superiority of another class, which then again intersects with, the idea of some conspiracy theories and so on. And I was wondering, because as I understood it, the framework really lays out like an idea of, whiteness to blackness. So an idea of like a imagined superiority to inferiority, how these kind of racial perceptions fit in that framework.
No, I think that's a really excellent question. And I think it's such an important area to really kind of delve deeper because, so much of the emergence of race as a global phenomena emerged through kind of the proto-racial period of kind of religious classifications and the kind of anti-Jewish practices that were being produced within Western Europe, particularly Spain at the time. And then how that got evolved, particularly, reaching its height within obviously German racial ideology around anti-Jewish racism. And I keep going back to is how kind of a Jewish racial identity writ large, gets racialized in key and distinctive ways, but also that is fluid and malleable. So I think there is a tendency to kind of just like blanket kind of anti-Semitism without getting into the larger history of how anti-Jewish racism looked differently in different places and how different groups were able to maneuver into different positionalities. There's a very famous book here in the United States' context called How the Jewish Became White that looks at kind of that malleableness category of whiteness that doesn't, minimize the racism that Jewish communities experienced, but also shows how they were able to maneuver and assimilate into ways that, for example, African Americans were not. And I think we can look at this, with the going back to intersectionality of kind of, is it just anti-Semitism? Is it also how other racialized ideologies intersect? And it gets into the really complicated and nuanced analysis of kind of what's going on in Israel and racial divisions within Israel, even for all Jewish populations. So you have Jewish African populations who are moving into Israel who are structured differently within that context. So I guess I just call for us to have an analysis of, yes, racism is important context of thinking through anti-Jewish anti-Semitism, and also how it's fluid and shapes and it gets performed in different ways. But even when Jewish identities have to respond to racism in that way, I never make a claim that it's kind of equal to the larger forces of global white supremacy, because that's who created that type of identity. Does that kind of help think through that a little bit? And an interesting, just the term anti-Semitism that we use, that term avoids the whole history of how, Arab cultures were part of that as well, right? And so like how we think about the politics of when terms get used and deployed and how they're used today, I think is an interesting, important thing to think about.
All right, thank you, Michelle. Vanessa, I see your hands up.
Yes, thank you, Professor Christian, for presenting here today. There were wonderful insights about critical race theory, which is what we very much advocate in law science. Like, we need theoretical informed scholarship aim at promoting this social, economic, and environmental justice, right, in the tradition of legal realism. So my background is, I study issues at the intersection of law and technology. So my comments come from this point of view. And I realize that there is a constant misunderstanding of what technology is capable to do. And there is this consolidated opinion that machine learning and algorithms can, of course, learn, act, and interact without human agency. And just recently, courts tried to uncover discriminatory instances perpetrated at the expense of marginalized communities, because we do not give some agency in the construction of the algorithm model. We just focus whether the algorithm has good or bad data, when the design that is behind it, it's extremely complex to be uncovered under the sole umbrella term of artificial intelligence. So to this end, I think that critical race theory can be a great contribution to the law. And I am a JSD candidate here at the University of Illinois, and I came from Italy. So since you just put Italy into the spot, was extremely illuminating, because most of the population in Italy just ignores blatantly racist instances. So race is not an issue, it's something that happens in the US. But most of the time, we as research social scientists do not have access to that data, because it's just shielded behind sensitive information and privacy. So if we want, because you mentioned that you're also trying to develop an empirical studies on race and probably at the intersection of race, gender, and other type of studies, how can we solve this limitation in empirical research? Thank you.
Such a good question. Yeah. Well, first off, yes, I'm really fascinated by race and technology, and I'm trying to think of a way of incorporating it into my book, particularly on thinking through global capitalism embedded within technology too, and how technology practices and products are also framed as like the saviors of countries in many ways, and the saviors for us here. But, you know, I'm sure you've heard of Ruha Benjamin's book, Race Beyond Technology, which is I really kind of go to whenever I'm thinking through this issue. And also Tressie Cotton McMillan has just written a piece on platform capitalism, where she gets to how, you know, platforms like Uber, DoorDash, all the things that we've used within the kind of pandemic economy to such high extents are also reproducing racialized logics and practices. So yes, I think with the technology level, I think just like a lot of scholars are starting to begin to, but I also feel, even though I'm kind of on the outskirts of that literature, that they're getting pushed back from like making race an important process of that. But I think that's what you have to do, is just acknowledge that programmers and computer scientists are emerging in racialized societies. And so the thoughts, the practices that they're bringing with them to the facilitation of these products are racialized products, even if they don't realize that they are, because that's part of how colorblindness has worked, particularly in the last 60 plus years or so, is that we don't realize that we're in a racialized society, particularly for those racialized as white, because you just think that world works like that, you know, as opposed to being structured in really key ways. So I just keep going back to, how do you bring race consciousness into that analysis and picture? And I think some of the folks that are pushing back on AI, for example, and this idea that AI will save us, and kind of calling out the racialized assumptions built into AI, the accents that Siri has, all of this stuff, right? That tells us something about how the tech companies racialize us, and then how they think that who we want to hear talk back to us and why. My advisor is Puerto Rican, and he would always talk about like how he was treated differently because of his accent, and how his accent separated him, in addition to kind of how he was racialized, as a further process to de-intellectualize him as a professor. And so I think there's just, going back to there's all these markers of racialization that are beyond phenotype. And I think we get lost within that a bit. But markers of racialization are connected to the larger logics of those racial hierarchies, right? But they're beyond just these phenotypical descriptions. So I don't know if I'm fully answering the technology question, but yes, we need also better laws to govern that, right? So, and I think just again, this bringing race consciousness into it is so important. And this gets to one of the reasons why I'm so animated by this project is that I've realized really diving into this research over the last year of how colorblind, post-racial, whatever the terms I'm using for that geography is in these places, that it's denied even the epistemological possibility of race. Like realizing that scholars feel that they can't even study it, like you're saying, like in Italy, you can't even get access to the data. For example, I know like there are racist incidents against African migrants in Italy. I know that violence has occurred. I know that it's been quite brutal, but if that language is not even there where that is about race, and when it's even the most overt examples, that's what I'm really trying to grapple with, right? And so that's what I was trying to get back with the conservative right politiculture, is that we've now reached an apexness of color blindness that even what we would describe 30 years ago as, okay, that's classically racist, is not racist anymore. So it's telling us something about knowledge, ideology, et cetera, that people are disavowing even the possibility. So I think as an Italian scholar, go back, and I know there are actually some Italian scholars who have started this project. I could send you some links of some names, and I know who are doing this work to push that. But I think a challenge, and this is another theme I'm seeing, is that if you're a scholar from these communities that I've just mentioned, you're also, and you want to study race and racism, you're doing it from outside your geography. So a lot of those Italian scholars were not based actually in Italy. So that, what is that telling us if people feel like they can't even do the work within the spaces that they would like to do the work in, and the pushback that they get? So I think, this now gets into the movement aspect of CRT, the scholar activism. Like, I think building communities of knowledge across these systems and advocating for this is so important. But then when you're up against these post-racial societies where they literally are like, we're not even going to allow the term race within our constitution, within our legal code, I mean, that's a level that is very hard to kind of fight against, right? Because they're completely disavowing it. And that's kind of where we're headed here in the United States, unfortunately. But I think there's enough critical pushback here in the United States and a history of resistance and racial consciousness through kind of Black epistemologies, longer history even before CRT, that have always resisted this. And I think going back also to the colonial tradition as well. So that's kind of a meandered answer, but I will happy to try to put you in line with some folks, and please go do that work, because we desperately need that data. And I think part of it will be, you're gonna have to collect the data yourself. So if you're not getting access to like government reports of these issues happening, then you're gonna have to go into the field and collect that data yourself. So it's in designing those types of studies that give you that kind of robust analysis where you really can figure out what's going on. My last pitch, Camille Hawthorne, Black Italian woman based here in the United States, has been doing really important work too on how Black Italians are fighting back against kind of this post-racial non-racism within Italy, kind of pushing government to acknowledge this. And that might be ways, particularly for, Italians racialized as white, could work in solidarity to kind of do that work to get the government to respond in key ways.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. That's a very detailed and comprehensive answer.
I'm like, because I'm thinking about all of this right now and I'm on leave and I don't get to talk to anybody. So I'm just kind of like
glad to have this conversation. Yeah, so unfortunately we have run out of time. I know we have another participant online, so maybe you can write to the professor, or if the professor can stay up for a couple of minutes. But thank you so much, everyone.
I'm sorry. I just want to take a picture of some screenshots.
Yeah.
Can I ask everyone just to turn on the camera for 30 seconds? Or just make it quick.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy.
Everyone can just turn on the camera.
So everyone can just turn on the camera and let's take a picture.
I'll just, so everyone ready? Great. 3, 2, 1. One more time. 3, 2, 1. just okay. I think let me see. I got it. Great. Thank you.
Tamara, you and I could talk at some point. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so our next session will be held on October 28th. We'll hold a roundtable on economics from a Latin American perspective. Again, very nice to see you all today. And I look forward to seeing all of you at our next event. Thank you.
Thank you.